The United States Army has been operating without a permanent chief of staff since Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth fired General Randy George in April. At the same time, Iran's missiles and drones have exposed serious vulnerabilities in American bases, air defenses, and military logistics across the Middle East. That does not prove one personnel decision caused every battlefield failure, but it creates a question Washington cannot responsibly avoid. Did the administration weaken critical military leadership precisely when the United States needed it most? Start with the leadership vacuum because this is measurable. When Hegseth took office, the Army had 10 active duty 4-star generals. That number has fallen to 5, the fewest in decades. Some positions were eliminated, others were downgraded, and some remain vacant. General George was removed as Army Chief without a publicly stated explanation. General Christopher Donahue's European Command was reduced to a 3-star position. General David Hodden, selected to oversee the command responsible for transforming and training Army forces, was removed months later. And Army Secretary Dan Driscoll is reportedly preparing to leave as well. Any president and defense secretary have the authority to change leadership. Generals are not entitled to permanent positions simply because they are respected inside the institution. A new administration can reasonably argue that an entrenched bureaucracy needs disruption, but that defense only works if the disruption produces something stronger. That is where the record becomes much harder to explain. The Army Command, left without permanent leadership, has responsibility for training and equipping ground forces, including Patriot missile crews. Those crews have been central to protecting American troops from Iranian ballistic missiles. Meanwhile, the Army has been consuming scarce Patriot interceptors during sustained combat operations. And one of the commanders pushed toward retirement, Christopher Donahue, had overseen forces learning directly from Ukraine how relatively inexpensive drones could transform a battlefield. When Iran opened the war with waves of Shahed-type drones, personnel trained under that command were reportedly dispatched to reinforce defenses in the Middle East. So the relevant standard is not whether Hegseth had the legal authority to reorganize the army. He did. The relevant standard is whether the people being removed possessed capabilities the military suddenly needed in an actual war. Look at this sequence. Leadership focused on modernization and drones gets disrupted. Senior positions become vacant or consolidated. Then American forces confront exactly the kind of drone and missile warfare those officers had been preparing for. That is correlation, not automatic proof of causation. Iran would still possess missiles if Randy George had remained army chief. American bases would still be geographically vulnerable. Patriot inventories would still be expensive and finite, but it means the administration now carries a heavier burden. Show that its replacements, reorganizations, and vacancies improved readiness rather than degrading it. The battlefield evidence has not made that case easy. American intelligence and surveillance installations across the Middle East have reportedly suffered extraordinary damage from Iranian attacks. Repair costs are expected to run into billions of dollars. American planners are reconsidering whether some large fixed Gulf installations remain viable against an adversary capable of repeatedly targeting them. Think about what that means strategically. For decades, the American security architecture in the Gulf depended partly on forward bases that allowed the United States to move aircraft, intelligence, supplies, interceptors, personnel, and command capabilities close to potential conflicts. If those installations become too vulnerable to operate normally, the problem is bigger than damaged buildings. Distances increase, logistics become harder, aircraft and ships require support from farther away, and regional governments begin asking whether the American security umbrella they organize their own defense policies around still functions the way it once did. That brings us to a second decision that deserves much more scrutiny. Early in Hegseth's tenure, senior military commanders were asked about reducing the Defense Department's civilian harm mitigation and response program. The commanders did not simply embrace eliminating it, Central Command reportedly argued that cutting the capability could increase the risk of target misidentification and reduce battlefield awareness. Hegseth dramatically reduced the program anyway. That matters because civilian protection is often described as though it were merely a humanitarian restraint placed on military power. It is also an intelligence and targeting function. Knowing who is present, understanding patterns of civilian activity, identifying targets accurately, and evaluating previous strikes can improve operational effectiveness. By the time the United States entered the Iran war, the program had reportedly fallen from nearly 200 personnel to roughly 2 dozen, with Central Command reduced from 16 positions to essentially one person handling the mission. Then came civilian deaths, congressional scrutiny, and reports that the Pentagon may partially restore the capability. That sequence deserves a simple standard. If a program was unnecessary bureaucracy, why restore part of it after combat exposed the consequences commanders had warned about? The administration can argue that war always produces civilian casualties and that a more aggressive targeting philosophy can shorten conflicts by applying overwhelming force. That is the strongest version of the defense, and it should not be dismissed automatically. But 6 months into a war without a decisive political settlement, the argument that fewer safeguards would produce faster strategic success becomes much harder to sustain. And this is exactly where political information becomes dangerous for ordinary people. You can hear one fragment, bureaucratic program eliminated to increase lethality, and reasonably conclude that somebody simply removed red tape. Only later do you discover that commanders themselves considered that capability operationally valuable. That missing context can turn a confident political argument into a credibility problem. Don't Get Played gives you a repeatable method for catching that before you repeat it. The digital ebook is $9 one time. Use the first link in the description or pinned comment because the next contradiction goes directly to the decision to enter the war. Before the conflict, senior officials were not presenting Donald Trump with one unanimous assessment that military action would be quick, contained, and decisive. Intelligence officials reportedly warned about escalation and instability. Tulsi Gabbard cautioned about the consequences of removing Iran's leadership. J.D. Vance reportedly favored diplomacy. Other officials presented a much more optimistic military picture. Trump chose the more aggressive course. Again, presidents are elected to make decisions precisely because advisors disagree. Trump was not obligated to follow the cautious recommendation merely because it came from intelligence officials. Intelligence agencies can be wrong. Generals can be wrong. Diplomats can underestimate the usefulness of force. So judge the decision by what happened afterward. 6 months later, Iran has not simply disappeared as a strategic problem. The United States has absorbed casualties, damage to installations, pressure on interceptor inventories, enormous financial costs, and a continuing challenge around the Strait of Hormuz. Washington is now emphasizing economic warfare and sanctions as it searches for leverage that military force did not conclusively produce. That does not establish that every warning before the war was correct. It establishes something more limited but politically important. The optimistic assumptions did not produce the clean outcome Americans were encouraged to expect. Now combine that with what was happening inside the army. You have a defense secretary removing experienced officers. You have a shortage of senior four-star leadership. You have a permanent army chief still missing months after Randy George's dismissal. You have Republican resistance in the Senate to Hegseth's preferred successor, General Christopher LaNave. And you have an actual conflict demanding expertise in missile defense, drone warfare, logistics, modernization, and force protection. That last point matters because opposition to these decisions is not neatly partisan. Senator Joni Ernst, an Iowa Republican who served in the National Guard, has reportedly opposed LaNave's elevation. After George was fired, she raised the issue directly with Trump. Trump reportedly told her that George's removal had been Hegseth's decision and expressed regret about what happened. That does not tell us why every personnel decision was made. It does tell us this cannot simply be dismissed as Democrats complaining about a Republican defense secretary. And it raises a deeper institutional question. What happens inside a military organization when senior officers conclude that delivering unwelcome advice can threaten their careers? A president absolutely has the right to demand that military leadership execute lawful civilian policy. Civilian control of the military is fundamental. Generals do not get to veto an elected president because they disagree with him, but civilian control is not the same thing as personal loyalty. The system depends on officers being willing to tell civilian leaders that ammunition is running low, that a target is questionable, that a strategy is failing, that an enemy has adapted, or that the president's preferred option carries unacceptable risk. If officers start optimizing their advice for what political leadership wants to hear, the president becomes less informed precisely when presidential authority becomes most consequential. So apply the same standard with the parties reversed. If a Democratic defense secretary removed combat experienced commanders, left major positions vacant during a war, faced resistance from senators in his own party, and then confronted battlefield problems closely related to the expertise that had been disrupted, would the secretary has the authority to reorganize be a sufficient explanation? It should not be. There is another distinction we need to protect here. None of this proves that Hegseth deliberately wanted American forces to perform poorly. It does not prove that every Iranian success resulted from his decisions. And it certainly does not mean the American military has suddenly become incapable of fighting. The United States retains enormous naval, air, intelligence, technological, and economic power. The question is whether that power has been managed competently. Raw military strength cannot eliminate logistics. A multi-billion-dollar weapons system still needs ammunition. A carrier still needs supplies. A missile battery still needs interceptors. Intelligence equipment still needs defensible locations. And the most sophisticated military on earth still needs commanders who can tell political leaders something they do not want to hear. That is why the personnel story and the Iran story cannot be evaluated separately anymore. One concerns the people making military judgments, the other is testing those judgments under fire. And the strongest evidence is not a dramatic quote from a critic. It is the accumulation of concrete outcomes: senior vacancies, depleted defensive resources, damaged regional infrastructure, civilian protection capabilities cut over commanders' objections, Republican resistance to leadership choices, and a war that moved from expectations of decisive military results toward another campaign of economic pressure. There is a legitimate defense of the administration. Military institutions sometimes resist necessary change. Seniority does not guarantee innovation. Cheap drones have exposed weaknesses across Western militaries, not merely the Pentagon under Hegseth. Iran has spent years designing forces specifically to exploit American vulnerabilities in the Gulf. No defense secretary could erase those structural problems overnight. That defense partially survives. It explains why some battlefield difficulties would exist regardless of personnel decisions. What it does not explain is why, during those exact difficulties, the Pentagon would tolerate prolonged leadership vacancies and remove officers associated with adapting the army to the battlefield now confronting it. And that brings us back to the contradiction at the beginning. The administration says it is rebuilding American military strength, yet some of the people responsible for preparing that force for modern warfare have been removed, sidelined, or left without permanent replacements, while American forces are actively absorbing the consequences of modern warfare. The evidence supports a serious conclusion, but not an unlimited one. We can establish that the Army's senior leadership has been substantially thinned. We can establish that important positions have remained vacant during a major conflict. We can establish that commanders resisted cuts to civilian harm mitigation before those capabilities were gutted. We can establish that Iranian attacks have imposed major costs on American installations and forced difficult questions about Gulf basing and missile defense. What remains unresolved is exactly how much each Pentagon personnel decision contributed to each battlefield setback. That requires more than political rhetoric. It requires operational records, congressional oversight, readiness data, ammunition figures, and honest testimony from military leadership. And responsibility ultimately reaches above the generals. Hegseth controls the Defense Department under the authority of the President. Trump chose Hegseth, retained him, chose which competing advice to accept before the Iran war, and owns the strategic decisions of his administration. If those decisions succeed, the administration deserves credit. If they fail, responsibility cannot suddenly be transferred to anonymous bureaucrats, departed generals, or an enemy for exploiting vulnerabilities Washington had a duty to anticipate. That is the larger lesson here. Military power is not measured by how aggressive a Pentagon video sounds or how often officials use words like strength and lethality. It is measured by whether American service members have competent leadership, sufficient defenses, realistic objectives, reliable logistics, and political leaders willing to hear bad news before Americans pay for it. Another political clip, military claim, poll, accusation, or official explanation will soon ask you to decide what happened before the full record is visible. Don't Get Played is a digital method for becoming harder to manipulate and better able to defend your political convictions with evidence. It costs $9 once. Use the first link in the description or pinned comment. Because reacting to politics is easy. Reaching a conclusion you can actually defend is harder.